November 11, 1943, 28,000 feet above Bremen, Germany. Temperature -40 degrees Celsius. Hauptmann Werner Schröer banked his Messerschmitt Bf 109G6 through the thin, freezing air, his oxygen mask tight against his face. The cockpit glass had partially frosted, despite the special coating applied the night before. Through gaps in the crystalline patterns, he counted the American bombers, B-17 flying fortresses, their aluminum fuselages catching the winter sun as they approached the German industrial center in tight formation. Achtung, Adler Squadron, 60 bombers, perhaps more behind. Standard interception, focus on the lead elements, Schröer ordered through his throat microphone, the cold metal pressing against his neck. His fingers, despite the electrically heated gloves, felt stiff on the control column. Schröer had 18 confirmed victories. The pilots in his squadron respected him not for this number, but for his methodical approach to aerial combat. Today would test that methodology. Intelligence had warned of a heavy raid. What intelligence had not mentioned was the distant glint of fighter escorts, more numerous than ever before. "New escorts at our altitude," came the voice of his wingman, Feldwebel Kraus. "They don't look like Thunderbolts." The Luftwaffe pilots had grown accustomed to the P-47 Thunderbolts that typically escorted the bombers. These American fighters, while formidable, had limited range and usually turned back halfway across Germany. Today something was different. The escort fighters stayed with the bomber formation, and their silhouettes seemed more streamlined, more threatening. Schröer pushed the throttle forward, feeling the DB605 engine respond with a surge of power. The altimeter needle trembled as he climbed to position his squadron above the American formation. 24 German fighters against hundreds of Americans. The arithmetic of aerial warfare in late 1943 was becoming increasingly unfavorable. The morning sun flashed on metal as the first of the unknown escort fighters broke from the bomber formation and climbed to meet them. Their wings were distinct, longer, more tapered than the Thunderbolts. The noses were sleeker, with a radiator scoop underneath that gave them a predatory profile. "Mustangs," Schröer said quietly to himself, recognizing the aircraft from intelligence photographs. The P-51 Mustang, once a mediocre British design, now reborn with the American Packard Merlin engine. His squadron had never faced them before. None of them had, and they were about to discover why that mattered. For 2 years, the Luftwaffe had developed tactics to counter American bomber formations. The heavy B-17s and B-24s flew in defensive boxes, creating interlocking fields of 50 caliber machine gun fire. German pilots learned to attack from the front, making high-speed passes that gave the American gunners minimal time to track them. But the fatal flaw in American strategy had always been fighter escort range. Their P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings could only accompany the bombers part of the way. Once the escorts turned back for England, German fighters could engage the bombers with relative impunity. This tactical advantage had allowed the Luftwaffe to inflict heavy losses on unescorted bomber formations. On October 14, 1943, just weeks before, 60 American B-17s were shot down during the second raid on Schweinfurt, a catastrophic 14% loss rate. Oberleutnant Kurt Goltz, Schröer's deputy, had developed specialized tactics for their Geschwader. Their Bf 109G6 fighters carried 20mm cannon in gondola pods under the wings, extra firepower for breaking up bomber formations, but at the cost of maneuverability. The weight and drag of these weapons transformed the once nimble Messerschmitt into a more sluggish interceptor. "We sacrifice agility for killing power," Goltz had explained during briefings, "but it doesn't matter. We only need to outmaneuver the bombers, not their escorts. Once the P-47s turn back, we own the sky." This doctrine had worked. Until now, the Mustangs were staying with the bombers. The sky over Bremen was no longer going to be exclusively German once the escort fighters turned back. It would be contested the entire way. Schröer's squadron had other disadvantages. Fuel shortages meant limited training time for new pilots. 6 of his squadron's pilots had less than 50 flying hours. The Americans, by contrast, received over 200 hours before combat deployment. More critically, German pilots now stayed at the front until they were killed or wounded. American pilots rotated home after completing their tour of duty, bringing their experience back to train the next generation. The Messerschmitts climbed to 30,000 feet, their engines straining in the thin air. From this altitude, Schröer could see the industrial haze over Bremen to the east and to the west, the seemingly endless stream of American aircraft. The Mustangs were no longer distant specks, but fully formed threats, climbing toward his formation with alarming speed. Schröer checked his gun sight, adjusted his oxygen flow, and prepared for the intercept. The squadron had practiced this hundreds of times: dive through the escort screen, attack the bombers, then escape using superior diving speed. But something told him this encounter would be different. These Mustangs moved differently. They climbed with an ease that suggested power reserves his Messerschmitt lacked. "Adler Squadron, Titan formation," he ordered. "We attack as planned. Target lead bombers, then dive east toward Bremen flak cover." 20 seconds later, the first Mustang opened fire from a range that seemed impossibly long. Schröer watched in disbelief as tracers streaked past his canopy with alarming accuracy. The Americans weren't supposed to be this aggressive. They weren't supposed to be here at all. December 6, 1943. Luftwaffe Fighter Wing, 27 Headquarters, Northern Germany. 25 days after the Bremen raid. The operations room was thick with cigarette smoke and tension. Maps covered the walls, marking American bomber routes and the steadily expanding range of their fighter escorts. Red pins indicated German aircraft losses. White pins showed Allied losses. There were far too many red. Schröer stood before the assembled pilots, his face gaunt from repeated combat sorties. "The Mustang changes everything," he said, tapping a diagram of the P-51 pinned to the briefing board. "It has the range of a bomber and the performance of a fighter. At high altitude, it outperforms our Bf-109s. The room remained silent. The pilots had all now encountered the Mustangs. Many had not returned. "I've analyzed every engagement over the past 3 weeks," Schröer continued. "Our standard interception tactics are failing. The Mustangs stay with the bombers all the way to the target and back. They have the fuel reserves we lack." Hauptmann Adolf Galland, one of the Luftwaffe's leading tacticians who had been sent to assess the situation, interrupted. "The British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The Americans have mounted it in the Mustang airframe. It's transformed a mediocre aircraft into a superior one." Schröer nodded. "And their fuel capacity allows them to fly missions exceeding 8 hours. Our Bf-109s are limited to less than 2 hours at combat power." What Schröer proposed next was tactically sound, but culturally heretical. For years, Luftwaffe doctrine had emphasized aggressive attack. Fighter pilots were taught to seek combat, to engage the enemy regardless of conditions. This offensive mindset had served the Luftwaffe well during the Blitzkrieg years of 1939-1941. But now, facing overwhelming American numerical superiority and the new Mustang, such tactics had become suicidal. "We must change our entire approach," Schröer said, revealing a set of hand-drawn tactical diagrams. "First, we avoid combat with Mustangs when they have the altitude advantage. Second, we stop attacking bomber formations when strong fighter escorts are present. Third, we conserve our forces by withdrawing when conditions are unfavorable." The room erupted in objections. "We are fighters, not cowards," shouted one senior pilot. Galland raised his hand for silence. "The Reichsmarschall has demanded maximum bomber destruction regardless of losses," he said, referencing Hermann Göring's standing orders. "These proposed tactics directly contradict those orders." "Then we will die, and the bombers will still get through," Schröer replied quietly. "The Mustang has changed the equation. The risk was professional and personal." Advocating tactical retreat contradicted years of Luftwaffe doctrine and the explicit orders of the High Command. Officers had been relieved of duty for less, yet Schröer persisted, spending nights drafting detailed tactical manuals. He worked by lamplight in his quarters, using a vernier caliper to measure turn radii on scale aircraft models, calculating energy retention rates during various maneuvers. He documented the Mustang's few weaknesses: slightly reduced low-altitude performance, vulnerability during maximum rate turns at specific speeds. Most critically, he created engagement and disengagement criteria, specific, measurable conditions under which pilots should refuse combat. This was revolutionary. German fighter pilots had never been trained to avoid a fight. On December 20th, without official authorization, Schröer distributed his tactical manual to his squadron. "Follow these procedures," he told them privately. "I take full responsibility." His pilots studied the forbidden document, memorizing its contents before destroying it as instructed. They would test these tactics in the crucible of aerial combat, against the most formidable fighter the Allies had yet deployed. January 11th, 1944. 27,000 feet above Oschersleben, Germany. The air battle began at 11:22 hours. The temperature was minus 45 degrees Celsius. The American bomber formation, over 200 B-17s, appeared first as a constellation of dots against the deep blue upper atmosphere. Their contrails formed parallel white lines across the sky, pointing like accusing fingers toward the Focke-Wulf aircraft factory below. Schröer's squadron maintained position at 31,000 feet, hidden in the sun, another element of his revised tactics. Below them, a second German fighter group moved into standard attack position. They had not adopted Schröer's methods. Adler leader to squadron, observe only. "Do not engage until ordered," Schröer transmitted, his voice steady despite the tension. Through his gun sight, Schröer counted at least 60 Mustangs escorting the bomber formation. They flew in 4 aircraft flights, stacked at different altitudes, a layered defense surrounding the bombers. The second German fighter group initiated their attack, diving toward the lead bombers. Immediately, a dozen Mustangs peeled away from the formation to intercept. The air battle devolved into the chaotic swirl of a Luftkampf, an aerial melee. Schröer watched as the Mustangs devastated the attacking German fighters. Their superior high-altitude performance allowed them to control the engagement, choosing when and how to attack. Within minutes, 5 Bf-109s spiraled downward, trailing smoke. "Observe their tactics," Schröer radioed to his pilots. "They maintain energy, they fight in pairs. They disengage when position is unfavorable." The irony wasn't lost on him. The Americans were executing the same energy conservation tactics that he was now advocating, tactics that the Luftwaffe had pioneered early in the war, but had since abandoned in favor of increasingly desperate attacks. 20 minutes into the battle, Schröer identified the opportunity he had been waiting for. A section of bombers had separated slightly from the main formation, with only 4 Mustangs nearby. More importantly, these Mustangs were at a lower altitude than Schröer's squadron. Adler leader to squadron. Execute plan dry. Target bombers only. Disengage immediately after first pass. His 12 Messerschmitts rolled into a shallow dive, building speed while maintaining their energy advantage. The crucial element was timing. They would make a single firing pass through the bombers, then continue diving away before the Mustang escorts could respond. Schröer's gun sight settled on the lead B-17. He pressed the cannon button on his control column, feeling the Messerschmitt shudder as the 20mm shells left the wing-mounted gondolas. Explosive rounds peppered the bomber's right wing and engines. The bomber didn't go down, but fell behind its formation, trailing fuel. Throughout the formation, his pilots executed similar attacks, single passes, no turning back to re-engage, maintaining speed and energy. Within 45 seconds, they had struck 8 bombers and were diving away at over 400 miles per hour. The Mustang escorts turned to pursue, but Schröer's squadron had too much of a head start and too much energy. The German fighters leveled out at 18,000 feet, well clear of the American formation. "Regroup at Point Siegfried," Schröer ordered. Damage reports. All 12 of his aircraft were intact. They had damaged at least 6 bombers without losing a single fighter. The other German group, still entangled in turning fights with the Mustangs, had lost 11 aircraft while claiming only 3 bombers and 1 Mustang. The contrast was undeniable. Schröer's tactical adaptation, avoiding direct engagement with the superior Mustangs, making single high-speed passes, and preserving aircraft and pilots, had proved its worth. As they regained altitude for another potential attack, Feldwebel-Krauss broke radio discipline. "It worked, Herr Hauptmann. Your method worked." The squadron made 2 more carefully timed attacks during the mission, damaging several more bombers while losing only 1 Messerschmitt to a particularly determined Mustang pilot who had anticipated their escape route. When they landed at their base near Brunswick, the intelligence officers were waiting. Word of Schröer's unorthodox tactics had reached higher headquarters. The squadron's success, however, could not be ignored. 12 sorties, 11 returns, multiple bombers damaged or destroyed, a vastly better outcome than most interceptor units had achieved in recent weeks. The field test was conclusive. Against the Mustang, traditional tactics were suicidal. Adaptation was necessary for survival. February 22, 1944, Fighter Command Headquarters, Berlin. General Adolf Galland, now General of the Fighter Arm, stood before the assembled Luftwaffe leadership. Behind him, a chart displayed fighter losses from November 1943 through February 1944. The trend line pointed steeply upward. "Gentlemen, the situation is critical," Galland began. "In the past 90 days, we have lost over 700 single-engine fighters and over 500 experienced pilots. These losses are unsustainable." He placed a document on the conference table. "I am hereby implementing Directive 109-44, Tactical Conservation of Fighter Forces. This incorporates the engagement criteria developed by Hauptmann Schröer following initial encounters with the P-51 Mustang. The directive formalized what had been heresy just months earlier. German fighters would no longer attack at any cost. They would engage selectively, preserving aircraft and pilots when conditions were unfavorable. Most significantly, they would focus on avoiding Mustangs rather than seeking them out. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring was notably absent from the meeting, a deliberate choice by Galland, who knew that such tactical retreats would enrage Hitler's bombastic Air Force commander. "We face an adversary with superior numbers, increasingly superior equipment, and virtually unlimited fuel," Galland continued. "The P-51 Mustang can escort bombers to any target in the Reich. Our only hope is to preserve our fighter force until the new jet aircraft enter service in sufficient numbers." The Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter promised to restore technological superiority, but production delays meant it wouldn't reach squadrons in significant numbers until late 1944, if then. In the meantime, the Luftwaffe had to survive. Schröer's tactical innovations spread throughout the German fighter force. Pilots learned to identify Mustangs at extreme ranges, to gauge their fuel state by observing their behavior, to attack only when conditions provided a clear advantage. The era of the aggressive, never-retreat Luftwaffe fighter pilot was over, replaced by a more calculating, conservation-minded approach. The results were measurable. Fighter losses stabilized despite increasing American pressure. More importantly, experienced pilots survived longer, allowing them to pass their knowledge to newer pilots. Yet these tactical adaptations, while necessary, could not reverse the strategic situation. The Mustang had fundamentally altered the air war over Europe. American bombers now struck targets throughout the Reich, with powerful fighter escorts the entire way. German industry, despite dispersal and camouflage efforts, suffered increasingly devastating blows. Werner Schröer continued leading his squadron through the desperate air battles of 1944. He survived the war with 26 confirmed victories against Western aircraft and received the Knight's Cross. After the war, he would tell aviation historians, "The P-51 Mustang forced us to rethink everything we knew about aerial combat. When we first encountered it over Bremen, we knew immediately that the sky was no longer ours." The P-51 Mustang would go on to destroy more German aircraft than any other Allied fighter type. Its combination of range, speed, and altitude performance made it the definitive escort fighter of World War II. For the Luftwaffe pilots who faced it, the Mustang represented the moment when air superiority passed irrevocably to the Allies. From the official Luftwaffe tactical assessment, March 1944, the appearance of the North American P-51 with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine has created a fighter with capabilities that render our current interception tactics ineffective at high altitude. For the first time in this conflict, the enemy can project both bomber and superior fighter forces to any target within Greater Germany. This development fundamentally alters the strategic air situation in a manner that cannot be countered with existing assets.